Welcome to Sweeter Than Honey. Today's daily devotion is from Genesis 15. Genesis 15 is about Abram believing God. Abram believing God. This is a huge and important chapter for our understanding, and you're going to see that in verse 6 especially. As you outline the chapter, verses 1 through 6 speak of God talking to Abram. The entire chapter is God really addressing Abram. Abram is listening to God reassure him about the conditions and about the results, the coming results of the covenant. But God is speaking to Abram in most of the chapter. In verses 1 through 6, God promises Abram, this guy, Eliezer, who is not your child, he's just the head servant. He is not going to be the one who inherits your covenant possessions. You will have a child. And so verses 1 through 6, you will have a child. Verses 7 through 11, you will have the land. Then he puts Abram in a deep sleep and speaks to Abram during that time. Verses 12 through 16 speak of Abram and his descendants. Your descendants will be enslaved, and there is revelation about what will come of Abram's family. And then at the end of the chapter, verses 17 through 21, he tells Abram, your descendants, though they will be enslaved, there will come a time 400 years later where they will inherit the land, they will return to the land. Now, as you look at the chapter, as you go through the chapter itself, verse 1 is very important as God speaks to Abram in this time of uncertainty. Abram is still reeling, feeling that he has betrayed his side of the covenant and has rendered himself unworthy of the covenant promises. But God tells Abram, verse 1, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. There is promise of protection. I am your shield. And then there is promise of reward. Your reward will be great. And his reward from God was that he had that relationship with God that no one else possessed. He was a covenant recipient of God's promises. Then verse 2, Abram is really down. He says he doesn't have children. I remain childless. The one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir. God doesn't even call him by name. Get that out of your mind. Eliezer is not going to be your heir. This man will not be your heir. But a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And he took him outside and said, look up at the sky, count the stars. If indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And Abram looks up into the night sky, unimpeded by city lights, and Abram realizes, my descendants will be vast and almost numberless. Then, having heard that, we are given a very important faith memory verse in verse 6. Genesis 15:6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him, the Lord credited to Abram as righteousness. This is going to play a very important role in the New Testament. This verse is quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 4, in Galatians chapter 3, and then by James in James chapter 2. And so our understanding of salvation by faith is deeply impacted by Abram's belief in God and God's promises right here. Verse 7, he also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to take possession of it. then Abram's still worried, and he says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? The Lord said, Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. He brings them these animals, and the Lord instructs him. He cuts them up. This was a covenant ritual back then. And the two sides would make a covenant, and generally they would cut they would cut the animal in two, and the two people in the covenant would walk between those pieces of the animal as if to say, if I do not fulfill my part of the covenant, may my body be like the body of these animals. And then Abram he sees birds coming to devour the animals. He shoos them away. Verse 12, as the sun's setting, he falls into a deep sleep, and the Lord speaks to him during that sleep. And then he says, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. So he predicts the Egyptian slavery of the people of Israel later on, generations later. And God assures him in verse 14, I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. Afterward, they will come out with great possessions. That is the plundering of Egypt. Verse 15, you, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. It is interesting, it is very important to note God's explanation for this delay in their reception of their covenant inheritance. Verse 16 ends, For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. That is, God is telling him there will come a time where the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites, all of the nations that are there in the land of promise will be punished. They'll be driven out, but that time is not yet here. When that time comes and they have sinned the full measure of my judgment expectations, then they will receive my judgment. I will give you the land. Verse 17, when the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land from Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. As God, with this represented this theophany, physical manifestation of God, as he is that bodily representation of God, moves between the pieces of the sacrifices. God is in essence saying to Abram, this covenant is not going to be completed by us. This covenant, these promises will be completed by me. And this, and so certain am I that if I were to fail, may my being be split apart like these sacrifices. You see the notes behind me and the takeaways that are listed here. Notice 5 different takeaways. First of all is the idea of divine initiative. Divine initiative. That is, God is the one approaching Abram. He approaches Abram with the covenant. He approaches Abraham with the covenant reaffirmation. It is God and not God and Abraham who walk between the pieces of the animals. It is God alone, and it is his power, it is his will, it is his strength and sovereignty that will accomplish these covenant promises, not only for Abraham, not only for Abraham's descendants, but for all of humanity. Then also notice that as he's doing this, God is setting his redemptive plan in motion. Notice that there is an issue of timing. God's promises come to us not in our timing, but in God's timing. Sometimes there are factors that we don't understand. There are sins of other people that are to be taken into account, but we don't know those things. But God, in His omnipotence and His omniscience, deals with those things and knows those things. So there is a takeaway of timing, to understand God's timing. Also understand the issue of pain. God may promise us great reward, great blessing, but that does not mean that that reward and that blessing will come without pain. There is pain in this life. Pain is part of this life. And we are expected to go through that and to remain faithful with God. And then there's finally the principle of faith. We are expected, as we deal with God, to believe Him, because He has proven Himself and He is worthy of our trust and our faith. May this God, who is worthy of trust and faith, bless you and keep you and cause His face to shine upon you and give you peace. Amen.